Good to go? Yes, that sounds better. Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to IDS and this event for the book launch of Digital Disinformation in Africa, #activism and state propaganda. I'm standing in for our colleague Caroline, who's sadly unwell today. So first of all, I'd like to welcome our very honoured guests, the ambassador from the Embassy of Angola, the Ambassador Geraldo Nunda, who's very privileged to have you here, Mr. Helder Felou, Carla Pinto-João, Francisca Gaspar. Thank you very much for coming here today. Just to tell you about we're from the digital cluster at IDS, and just the speakers that you're going to be hearing from today in no particular order. Tony is a research fellow, my colleague here at IDS, and he's the co-editor of the book. He's part of the digital research team, and where his research focuses on digital inequalities, digital citizenship, and digital rights through the African Digital Rights Network. George, who's joining us remotely from Edinburgh, George Karakovanani is the co-editor, and he's a senior lecturer in the Centre for African Studies at the University of Edinburgh. So his research focuses on the social, political, and economic impacts of digital media in Africa, and also on the social and political history of law. Ed Milson, who's at the end of the table. He's an IDS postgrad researcher and author of one of the chapters. He works in international relations, South-South cooperation, democratization and political participation with a major focus on Angola. And finally, last but not least, Rotendo is one of the author of one of the chapters and a PhD student at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford, and her research looks at how Zimbabwean women and queer people experience citizenship when they engage state actors on social media. And just to say, this book is a very exciting and important edition. It is available to read open access online. I've already used it last week in my own teaching in democracy on democracy and social media, and got a great response from the students. So I'll hand over to Tony to introduce the book, and then we'll have some questions, and I'll lead with some questions.
Thank you, Becky. So my job is just to give you some context, to give a bit of background on the African Digital Rights Network and the broader book series before the more important part of this session, to listen to the authors tell us about the research they did and the contents of their chapters. So I'm based here at the Institute of Development Studies, and as Becky said, we work in the digital and technology cluster. And for the last 4 years, I've been co-leading the African Digital Rights Network. The African Digital Rights Network is a virtual network of 60 different researchers from 25 different African countries. And we've been working through the lockdown, hence why we're a virtual network. And since on a series of publications looking at digital rights across the region. And we were commissioned by media to do a special report on surveillance law. And most recently, a report on the supply lines of surveillance technologies to African governments. So looking at which companies from which countries are supplying which surveillance technologies to different governments. And in addition to that work, we have been commissioned by Z Books, and I see my colleague here from Z Books, to do a 6-book series of collected edition books. And these are the first 2. The Digital Citizenship book came out last year, and today we're launching the 2nd book, Digital Disinformation in Africa. Each of those books is more or less 10 chapters by 10 different African scholars and activists. Most of the chapters are country case studies. The first book was Digital Citizenship in Africa. This book is Digital Disinformation in Africa. We've now finished the transcript for Digital Surveillance in Africa. And there are 2 other titles in preparation: Internet Shutdowns in Africa and Feminist Digital Citizenship in Africa. So today we're here to talk about this book about digital disinformation. And there's been a lot of talk in the media in the last couple of months about all of the elections that are happening in 2024. This is a unique year. More people are going to the polls in 2024 than in any other preceding year. And in Africa, 17 different countries have elections. Disinformation is critical to those democratic processes because access to accurate information and the ability to freely engage in public debate, in deliberation and decision-making about the policies and issues that affect our lives is a basic tenet of democracy. And disinformation prevents us from doing that. Disinformation is the dissemination of falsehoods in order to pollute political processes. So it's intentional lies for political ends. And the issue of digital disinformation came to like global knowledge in 2016. So we first heard about it in relation to Brexit here in the UK and the Trump 2016 election. But digital disinformation had already taken place in two prior African elections. So in 2014, Cambridge Analytica were active in Nigeria and in Kenya. It's now 2024, so a decade later, we have disinformation has taken place in nearly every election that has taken place between 2014 and 2024. But this is the first book that's dedicated to documenting and analyzing how digital disinformation is affecting democratic processes around the world. And that's what we're going to hear from our panelists, looking at how that played out in different countries. So I think I'll leave it there and pass the mic there.
Back. Just briefly, I'm going to ask Rutendo to kick us off. If you can tell us what, in about 5 minutes, what were the key findings and the kind of insights from your chapter?
Sure. Is this working?
Good.
Awesome.
Yeah. Good.
Thank you. So my chapter specifically looked at disinformation in Zimbabwe on an event, or series of events in the early 80s, which was an ethnic genocide carried out by the state and state actors, which came to be known in popular discourse and popular lexicon as Gukurahundi. And what I found interesting was that to this day, there was still disinformation that kept cropping up on Twitter, specifically around this event or around this period. And so what I wanted to understand was, what are the discursive practices of those that actually engage and push this disinformation? And what does it do, if at all, to uphold certain hegemonic narratives? And how does it do that? And so I guess in like a really quick summary is there were sort of three main things that disinformation actors did to carry out disinformation on Twitter. I understand I'm saying disinformation a lot. It's very repetitive. But the first thing is semantic rationalization as a tactic. And that is this idea that we can start to argue about what actually counts as a genocide. Even though it was historical, right? And in so doing, they then can take away the sort of blame and responsibility from those that were responsible. And then the second one is historical interception. This is when we start to rewrite history and recreate the reasons for why something was done. So just very briefly, as I mentioned, this was an ethnic genocide. That is a very particular group of people were targeted because of their ethnicity. A lot of it has to do with ethno-linguistic separation. And so one of the historical interception tactics was to argue that this genocide was actually a response to pre-colonial relations, which is not true. And that was trying to justify the act and reframe the act. And then the third one is the misconstruction of textual contexts, which is when we see that because digital media allows us to have multiple forms of media attached to the way we speak, the way we provide evidence. People could provide what looked like academic text or what looked like the most interesting one for me was what looked like declassified CIA documents, but actually wasn't. So it was edited to sort of support that. But besides the practices, besides the tactics, I think what is important is that even though this is not necessarily about an election or about a very specific democratic process, we can see how disinformation supports current state power apparatus and also supports current narratives of myth making that are important or are considered important by certain states and by certain governments, and allows us to, or tries to create this sort of dissonance within the citizenry by clouding very important historical moments and minimizing or taking away power from citizens for them to question really why the state is the way it is and why the state works in the way that it works, especially in a context in which party politics are very much intertwined with what the state is. So hope I did that in about 5 minutes.
You did it in even less, and that was an absolutely brilliant summary. Thank you so much, and lots of very interesting themes that we'll be picking up on over the course of the next hour or so. Ed Milson, can we hear from you about your chapter and your
Yes,
contribution?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So I have done a contribution to the book on a chapter that focuses on Angola, which is, as Tony said, this is perhaps the first book that focuses on digital disinformation in Africa, but it's actually even more so when it comes to Lusophone Africa, where there hasn't really been many study on the digital space. And I looked at the 2022 elections, which has proven to be the most disputed elections in Angola. And my chapter pretty much analyzes how disinformation is fabricated in a very central state and the outcome of that disinformation. And what I have found is actually quite interesting is that in the Angolan case, whereby the youth account for the majority of the population, what we see is that the outcome of the disinformation from the state is sort of never reflecting the intended agenda of the political system, simply because we have now come up with a youth that have sort of found a new space within the digital space to sort of disrupt disinformation. This is the creation of memes, which is something that as I looked into the other cases, we see spaces like Twitter with the hashtags. In Angola, memes has now become sort of like a political instrument to really understand state-citizen relationship and to really challenge all this disinformation that in Angola starts from the traditional channels such as the national television, then is then moved into the digital space such as Twitter and Facebook, usually by members of the political party. But then when it comes to the broader civil society, it always backlashes. And what we see in the episodes that I show on my chapter is that all the disinformation episodes actually work in favor of the opposition party, simply because people have now found these new spaces where they sort of know how to communicate it to challenge this disinformation that is coming from the state. Another interesting element that I also found is that countries like Angola that have a very historical, traditional political system, like Angola, I'm not sure if that's the same case in maybe South Africa or even Zimbabwe, post-independent states, they have structure, a political structure that is very traditional, very sort of like bureaucratic. And in today's era of digital space, they find it very hard to adapt to it. And I think that's perhaps the reason why, one of the reasons why many of these disinformation attempts from the government didn't really work, because when something would come up online to challenge perhaps a disinformation regarding the opposition leader, until the decision from the political party comes down for them to react, people in Angola, the youth, they are already creating another memes. And I guess for a centralized country, I guess this space that has now been discovered by the youth, it's perhaps one that reflects a way in which young people have now found to feel more safe to communicate, express the feelings, but also I guess it's also a way for people to perhaps create an identity that has influenced the way the results in the capital city have come up. So I guess within my chapter, the most interesting aspect is really how, which I call in the chapter, the mimification of the political system, which is something that has really been sort of, becoming a challenge to the system. And we are now discussing our policies to restrict that space, when in reality, youth have now, through the social media, being able to find affordances for them to claim spaces, for them to challenge and disrupt this information. So my case is very much a case study whereby disinformation is sort of, find it hard to succeed, because young people who account for the majority have now found a new way to sort of, disrupt the status quo through the creation of memes, which is something funny, easy to share, but also pretty much easy for people to understand what's the message. Thank you.
Thank you. And it's really interesting to hear about memes as a strategy, and there's something that can be shared very easily. You can do them via WhatsApp through lots of different platforms. Last but not least, we're going to hand over to George in sunny Edinburgh.
Hi.
What are the key findings from your chapter?
This is one of the rare days where Edinburgh is actually sunny. So thank you very much. So my chapter focuses on Zimbabwe, and what I try to do is to understand the anatomy and the strategies of the pro-state network of or the pro-state troll army in the Zimbabwean Twitterverse. And they are commonly known as the Varakashi, or those who thrash, or those who can pummel you. And that's the kind of common moniker that they're known by. And what I've tried to do is to try and understand what are the kinds of strategies that they're using. And the way I approach them is to see the Varakashi as a network of different accounts. And I thought that a productive way of thinking about this network is to look at the division of labor in the efforts to peddle disinformation. And a lot of my chapter is to try and disentangle or disaggregate this network. And what I found as I was looking at this network, I found 6 sets of actors that comprise of these Varakashi. And this is an important shift, I think, in the literature, because often when people talk about the Varakashi, they seem to talk about them as a homogeneous mass. But when you actually look into Twitter, what you find is there are a number of actors doing different tasks. And the 6 kind of actors in this network that I found were the agenda setters, the people who are at the top, at the apex of this network, and who are setting the agenda and are giving the signals for the rest of the troll army to swarm. And then you have the amplifiers, the people who don't really do much in terms of tweeting their own ideas. They're either retweeting or trying to, increase the volume of the message that's coming from the agenda setters. And then there are, of course, the pseudo-news organizations. Those are the organizations that are, set up largely on Twitter and very limited circulation, but they're used to produce these false news or disinformation news articles that are then retweeted by the amplifiers. And then also the 5th group is the AstroTurf accounts. These are the kind of accounts that have, often it's alphanumerical names, something like 1502XYM. On Twitter, and that would be the account. And those are the kind of accounts that are also used to swarm. So what I found is that often if an opposition person was trying to criticize the state, they were often attacked by a lot of these AstroTurf accounts. And finally, they're the invisible techies, the kind of tech-savvy people who are working behind the scenes. What I found as I was doing the research is that there was a lot of choreography, a lot of, clipping of particular, whether it's producing memes or clipping of particular videos and releasing them at particular strategic moments. And all of this indicated that behind the scenes there were very tech-savvy people who were working. So that was in a sense the division of disinformation labor that I found within this network. And you could see that there are a number of goals that they had. And often these goals are described as in terms of Ds. And so to dismiss the people who disagreed with them, to distort the information, or to distract. If the conversation is starting to move into something that's really important and critical of the state, they try to distract the focus of people, and to create dismay. In other words, to threaten and intimidate people who criticize the state. They also try to divide. They're often peddling information that would sow seeds of division within the opposition opposition or within civil society. And finally, they often try to disrupt important conversations in the public sphere. So if people started talking about the government's power to alter the constitution, if that discussion started to gain, ground, someone would come in from this network and just start, insulting people using expletives, and they would then hijack the conversation, and it just descended into this kind of exchange of insults. And that important conversation about, constitutional amendments is then derailed. And that was the kind of, approach of disrupting. I guess after looking at all of this, looking at this network and the different, division of the different actors and the division of labor of disinformation, what I found at the end of the day was in Zimbabwe, what we found playing out was disinformation on a shoestring. This was an under-resourced government that was running on a low budget, and it had this low budget disinformation operation. However, that should not mislead us into thinking that these kind of disinformation operations that are run on a shoestring budget are not effective. They were effective in some respects. They were able to disrupt important debates, to shout down Western ambassadors. They were able to do a lot of effective things in terms of, crowding out people from the public sphere, at least in the Twitterverse. However, what I did notice is that these kind of shoestring budget operations, they lack the ability to act swiftly and in a coordinated way. So there was a lot of infighting within the different accounts that were part of this network, and there were a lot of tensions in the structure. So I guess in a sum, that is what I found, a kind of, a network of different accounts and disinformation on a shoestring.
Thank you, George. Just to open up some kind of key themes. One of the things that I really enjoyed about the book is the kind of historical perspective. So you're not saying there has never been, for all of the authors, there's never been disinformation before, but there's clearly something new about these new disinformation tactics, whether it's the state, whether it's individuals, whether it's external actors like Cambridge Analytica. And Tony, I wanted to unpack something about the title of the book, which has got power in it. And of course, it's got to do with IDS, so we have to put a power analysis in everything. Can you tell me about where's the power analysis and what's different about digital disinformation?
That's about 7 questions.
That's about 7 questions. Just do the last bit, because you haven't got all day.
Yeah, so the book ostensibly is about digital disinformation, but the subtitle of the book is #politics, power and propaganda. And all of the chapters are about power, disinformation being used for power retention. In some of the chapters, the disinformation is gender disinformation. So it's about trying to retain power for patriarchy. In other chapters, the disinformation is being used to contest elections. So it's about trying to retain power for a specific political party. But that's really at the heart of all of the chapters. And in these countries, we're talking about power that's been entrenched for 30 or 40 years, where literally the same party has been in power for 30 or 40 years. And so that power is entrenched in all of the institutions of the state. The state owns the media, the state controls the narrative. And what we see with disinformation, including the example that Edmilson just gave, is that in those closed spaces where the operation of power is hidden, what younger people are doing on social media is claiming and creating new spaces for a different kind of power, to raise issues that are being ignored by mainstream media, by mainstream political parties, and by legacy civil society organizations, and instead are creating their own narratives, counter narratives, challenging genocide narratives, challenging entrenched political power. And that contestation of power is taking place in these new online digital spaces. And that contestation of power is unruly politics. It's unruly both in the sense that it's not being played out by joining an existing political party or using an established media channel. And it's unruly because they're using bad language and cartoons and jokes to open up a new space for talking about politics and putting back on the table long neglected issues, and putting onto the agenda rights claims and demands for power sharing. So, you know, and that's playing out in each of the chapters.
So Rotendo, how do you see, both in your study that's in the book and in your ongoing kind of doctoral research, how do you see power operating both in terms of the closing of spaces, but people also kind of claiming new spaces and finding new languages and finding new community? How do you see the kind of reclaiming of power kind of panning out in digital spaces?
I think when you actually started, you also said something that was important, that I think all the chapters sort of acknowledge that disinformation is not new and is something that, you know, has been ongoing. I think one of the things that is interesting about my chapter is that the genocide in itself that I write about was a disinformation campaign. To begin with, at the very beginning. So in the 80s, the disinformation was that they were sending this specific brigade to go after dissidents, right? And I think going back to the idea of power now, the way that it's sort of, it's shifting is that all of those things that were used to buttress that event are now coming into question. And what digital spaces have done is provide people with the affordances to speak back to those things. So whereas back in the day, saying we're going after dissidents as either like a newspaper clipping or some press announcement in the radio and nobody could speak back. What we have now in terms of the people actually interviewed in the chapter, you will see is one of the participants talks about how she actually has videos of people speaking about that time. And only a lot of the times we notice that when people show that evidence, you know, that oral history that digital media is now allowing people to share, the disinformation actually kind of silent, it's quiet. And I think that's where we see that power shift now, whereas it was only one end that could uphold a certain narrative because they had control of what was the media at that time, and in Zimbabwe to date. They do not have control of a space such as Twitter, so to speak. And so that allows really multiple narratives to come through. And the affordances question is also important because it allows people to actually show evidence. In as much as the affordances have allowed people to use it for disinformation, it also allows those that are combating it to speak back and sort of, you know, provide counter-hegemonic narratives using those very same affordances. And so I think that's one of the ways that we see that that power shifting as well. And I think the second and last thing I will say on the power dynamic as it comes up in the work I do and in the chapter is that it is no longer just up to state actors, so to speak. It is not just up to you know, people that you would expect to, you know, like ministers or anybody, really ordinary citizens, so to speak, academics, researchers, and that really brings a lot more dynamic aspects into the conversation, moves the power away really in a way from the state, and also allows you to actually speak back to the state a lot of the times. And I think what then also becomes interesting is that the sort of network that we're looking at is that also the disinformation is no longer also just coming from the state. So that's also the negative part of the power, right? It's not just the fact that those that are speaking back to are now ordinary citizens, but it's also those that are doing the bidding of the state are also ordinary citizens. So I guess it has shifted those power dynamics in both positive and negative ways, but mostly through really just the affordances and the accessibility question and issue.
Thank you. That's a really great answer. Finally, Ed Milson, just pulling on that thread about the kind of affordances, and you started talking about the kind of visual activism, like
Right.
visual means, and just if you can reflect a bit on like why they're so popular, and has it got the kind of political dynamics of getting a whole kind of new communities of younger people who might not be interested in politics? And does that, because the big question we ask is like, how sustainable is kind of social media activism, and does it translate into real life activism?
Right.
Again, that's about 6 questions.
Right. Thank you. I think perhaps we can look at the results of the elections in the capital city and perhaps really come to the conclusion that it did play a massive role. You know, for the very first time in the history of the country, the ruling party lost heavily in the capital city, which is perhaps the main gate of the country. And that's also where majority of the people, you know, are using the internet. And what we see is perhaps we can say, I don't know whether people are just too lazy to read or maybe too bored to listen to the traditional media. But I guess Angolans, they have sort of like a very funny way to interpret things. And I think that plays a role. I think it's cultural. And as I look to the chapters of my colleagues, it's interesting how when we do sort of like a chronological history of episodes in terms of elections, we never really had, when it comes to like youth, we never really had episodes of I wouldn't say like radical offline spaces coming from the youth in the last 10 years since the end of the Civil War. What we actually have is these spaces where people feel comfortable to talk to one another and actually share in a way that they know is actually making sort of like a, you know, a bad feeling towards the government. So I think the fact that they're all very funny, and I think I shared some of them, I think the fact that they're all very funny and they sort of come right after the political system share something, and then they sort of have to find ways to combat that visual art, which is so hard to follow. I think when the current government opened this space, because we're talking about a country where all of this is very premature, this is actually the first time that we can perhaps say that digital space influenced elections in Angola. So I think when the government decided to open the digital space, they wanted to portray an image of proximity with the young people. They never really expected young people to use it the way they're using it. And I think now when you look at the power, it's really distributed because young people have now realized that actually with our funny memes, we are being able to tell you, we don't believe what you're saying about the opposition. We don't believe about what you're saying about X and Y. And I guess, like I said, even the hashtags that they created hashtags like in 2022, you like it, you know, warning the state that when it comes to the big day, we're going to vote against you because we don't believe on all this disinformation. So I think it's really very interesting. And I think it's one of the things that I say on the chapter is that we shouldn't look at it as a bad thing, because I truly do believe that as we transition to this modern age of digitalization, we might and we will need indeed the usage of the digital space to improve state-citizen relationship in Angola. But I guess the fact that the system is very traditional, they find it very hard to accept that this is the new reality. We have to accept that. So that's, I think, the unique thing with the memes that are part of our daily life now.
That's absolutely brilliant. And George, you've still got George?
Yes.
You still glad to see it. So I've got a question for you about the kind of research involved, and I know this is quite specialized technical research that you've done on like finding out who exactly the trolls are and doing that kind of data analytics. What would you like to see in like the next 5 years as the kind of follow-up to this book in terms of how you feel that African researchers should be looking at disinformation and looking at digital civic spaces? What do you think the most urgent research agendas and possibly methods, given that we can't, Elon Musk has shut down access to Twitter for researchers, given this kind of new reality? What would you like to see as a kind of emergent research agenda?
Yeah, I think one of the key things is the technical ability. So there's a training aspect. I think one of the key things that needs to be done really is the training aspects, capacitating people, and not just researchers, but also civil society people, to be able to tell when these kind of things are happening. So there are a number of tools that people can use, analytics tools, a lot of, algorithm. I was using Node Excel as a way of doing social network analysis. And I think we need to start having more and more of these tools becoming more commonplace. There's a question question about AI. Hopefully AI can help us do a lot of this work much more easily. And so that I think the very first point is really we need more training, because a lot of people are going through the internet and not knowing that they shouldn't necessarily trust what they see, and the algorithm just shapes an information diet for them, that they don't actually understand that maybe that a lot of that has been tampered with. So I think the first step for me is training and going beyond academia and actually training civil society journalists to be able to begin to monitor and maybe help to engage in takedowns. So that's, I think, the first thing. And then the next thing I think is because there's a lot of data involved. This is kind of big data research. So when I was doing research for my chapter, I was using Node Excel, and Node Excel allows you to pull in 18,000 tweets. And those tweets, there's an algorithm that works within Node Excel that allows you to then organize or do a social network map. So there's a lot of training that needs to happen and to begin to use that. And hopefully we can have AI tools that help us to do that. And hopefully, so I think that's definitely something that needs to be done at the next stage of this research. And my sense is that it's only going to get worse. I've been talking about disinformation on a shoestring. Now with the kinds of AI capabilities that are available, just one person can produce multimodal disinformation. If it's text, they can write fake articles, they can produce fake images, they can also produce fake videos, and they can maybe use an AI agent to generate a website and actually start posting these on many websites. So just one person can almost be a kind of conductor of an orchestra of disinformation and be able to do a lot of harm. So there is going to be a lot of work that we need to do as researchers to begin to become aware of what's going on and start, pointing out and training people and making the public aware, because there is definitely a big threat in terms of democracy and what people understand to be true.
Thank you. So, Georgia, setting out a really urgent research agenda. I know we've been looking a lot at generative AI in the cluster and looking at the kind of the threats, and it's absolutely terrifying. So we're going to open it up now to questions from the room and any questions from Twitter. And we've got a mic here. Any questions in the room? Starting off with Alex.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Alex Shackton. I'm a research fellow here. And congratulations on the book and on fascinating presentations. And I don't work on digital politics, except I have done some work with colleagues in Mozambique on the role of memes in fuel price protests, which was really interesting, and the intersections between memes spread by WhatsApp and the role of influencers. And that's something I did want to ask about. But I wanted to ask, going back to Ed Milson's point about, we don't believe your disinformation. And I'd like to ask, I think, both Rutinder and Ed Milson, who do people believe, right? And to what extent is that associated with, I feel like, closed, safe spaces, like a WhatsApp group of people you know? To what extent is it associated with perhaps the role of influencers? I was really interested in the story about the documents. So there's something about an authenticity claim and the faking of a document, but we've just heard from George that AI can fake oral testimony. So you may believe the words of someone who is a witness, but AI can fake those words for you as well. So just wanted to ask each of you to reflect in the context that you've been researching, kind of where does that trust, where do people place that trust, whether that's in terms of digital space or in terms of social relations? What is it that guides that trust, and who do you end up believing? And then specifically, George, in relation to your point about the shoestring, I was really interested because we had a very powerful presentation here from a Brazilian colleague who was studying Bolsonaro's disinformation network in Brazil. And the point about that is it's self-financing. A lot of it's about driving traffic to particular YouTube channels and pushing up the advertising revenue and so on. And so the hierarchy that you spoke about in terms of, who's orchestrating and is also actually about allocating resources. It's about driving clicks and driving views in the direction of things that generate revenue for content creators who are seen as helping spread the message, in this case about election fraud in Brazil. So did you come up with any sense that there were economic drivers at play, or is it literally that you know, a ruling party has a budget of X million for the next election campaign, and they're going to allocate part of that to digital disinformation and part of it to boots on the ground. And, you know, it's, if you like, it's a single source of finance as opposed to an ecosystem that feeds itself through algorithm-driven advertising and so on. I was just curious about that. Thank you.
So we'll take that question to George first about the kind of political economy of disinformation. Is it about clicks, or is it about a line item in a budget marked disinformation?
Thanks, Alex. That's a great question. That's really interesting. So I should preface my answer by saying I wasn't able to get anyone who agreed to be interviewed and to reveal the inner workings of this. So my answer is based on my own assessments of what was going on. And what I got was it's more of the latter. This is more of a line item. And so what you have is a lot of scaling up of these efforts, especially around election time, especially around the 2018 election, and then, you know, scaling down. And this has a lot to do with the fact that, you know, around election time, there's a lot of money that's more available. So I remember even university students were being invited to you know, they were being invited to come and join up, and they were given maybe an iPad, and they would be in a particular room, and they would be tweeting and this kind of thing. And those were the stories that I heard from the people I was speaking to. And then after that, you know, this crowd is disbanded. However, then you have in 2020, the kind of basis of my chapter is around the hashtag Zimbabwean Lives Matter. As you remember, in 2020, this Black Lives Matter, and then it reverberates in Zimbabwe, Zimbabwean Lives Matter. So they're caught flat-footed because this thing becomes very sort of viral, and they then decide to recapacitate their network. But so I got a sense that it's really about a line item, and I didn't find any influencer accounts really, or any YouTube accounts that, you know, have advertising income. There was no redirection to a particular, you know, kind of talking head who was sort of drumming up and providing red meat to the masses in that kind of way. Not really.
Can I just say something about that as well? And it comes from George's chapter. But when we looked across the book, originally we thought we were going to be seeing more Cambridge Analytica type stories where states were buying in as a service disinformation campaigns. And whilst that was the case in 2014 in Nigeria, in 2014 in Kenya, and in 2017 in Kenya, what we saw in this book was the domestication of that capability to within African governments. And George's chapter does a really good job in breaking apart the different parts of that lie machine. So he shows how ministers are opinion formers, and then a different group of people are charged with disseminating that message, and how it might then be picked up by the mainstream media that the state owns, before, and hopefully in order for it to become viral, then the general public are like the fourth audience. But if you can get that to run without paying any external consultants, you don't get into that kind of arms race of political marketing. So we thought we were going to see much more of that. Actually, that isn't what we saw in these chapters.
It's a question for Tendo and Milson. Who do you trust in these digital spaces? Who are the this is Alex's question, like, who are the gatekeepers? Where do people find trustworthy information? Who are the people they now trust?
So I think the best way to answer this would be to think about how, you know, the divide between the online and the offline is very gray, right? So things that happen offline are brought online, vice versa. And so that is to say, the way that we receive and perceive information online, the way we process it is also based on our offline realities. So in the context, specifically the Zimbabwean context, I would say in this research, as well as in the work that I do in my doctoral research, is we're finding out that people generally have a distrust of the government. So the government will say something, we'll be like, wait a minute, is it true? So who do we trust? We probably are going to trust a citizen who's verified it first before the actual sort of state-aligned information or a state-aligned actor. you do bring up an important point about like, AI and potential deepfakes and things like that. However, I think we are not yet there, thankfully. So in the sense that, people can edit. We do see a lot of like photoshopped things or a lot of miscontextualized things, aka like an image from 2002, and people say this happened yesterday. That does happen quite a bit, but then the verification cycle then happens. But in terms of actual like AI influenced disinformation, like could there be a deepfake of a witness saying this is what happened in 1984? So far, no, not really, because these are actual citizen-led documentaries, interviews, people going out to talk to people. So so far that hasn't happened. But in terms of who do we trust in the context that I look at, I think a lot of people's mistrust of the state and the government is informed by their offline realities. And, knowing how things are in real life and, seeing that gap and disconnect. So it builds a sort of more like a citizen trust system as opposed to citizen state trust. I don't know if that answers my context here.
I think the context of Angola sort of pretty much echoes what we just heard on Zimbabwe. I think that if you look at the data from my chapter, you would perhaps, to that question would answer that perhaps they believe the opposition. But because majority of the disinformation was obviously working in favor of the opposition. But it's not that they believe the opposition, it's just that they perhaps build a sympathy towards it and they didn't have no option. It's not that they believe you, they don't believe the other side. And I think when you look at the case of Angola, again, it comes down to these new actors that are perhaps showing the faces because many of these people that are creating the memes, we don't know them. They just start spreading. But those who are brave enough to show the faces and position themselves as voices for many people, those are perhaps the people that people believe, but we don't really put in the same stage because obviously the political space is so, restricted to two main political parties. So I would perhaps go as far and say that I look at it as a process where they are beginning to believe themselves because the positionality of the hashtags include themselves in making that decision to change things. Perhaps that's the findings from my case study.
Thank you. So I've got another question from Kevin. I'm biased towards members of the digital cluster because we're going to have a question from Caroline after that.
Hi, so my name is Kevin Hernandez and I'm a researcher at the Digital and Technology Cluster. And my question is, a lot of this conversation has focused on disinformation coming from state actors. My question is, did you come across a lot of any disinformation coming from non-state actors, maybe like online communities of some kind? And my other question specifically goes to Edmilson, which is there a risk that some of these memes themselves are misinformation? And then that people kind of have this self-fulfilling bias where they see something that they believe and then they just start sharing it, even though it might not be true.
Should I?
Go first, yeah. And just to say, I've got to leave at 5, so I'm going to hand over chairing to Tony at 5.
Oh. Can I? Okay. So very good question indeed. There is definitely that element because obviously it's very hard for people to filter what they share. And that's perhaps the danger within that space. And that's the reason why the government has been trying to come up with a way to really control it. But I think when it comes to the Angolan case, the fact that all these memes come as reactions to something, it sort of allows them to not go as far to the extent of becoming misinformation. It's like, let's say if the government says the opposition leader is not Angolan, and people are like, come on, let me show you that he's Angolan through a drawing of him, back in the days when he was young. I think usually that mimification that is happening, it comes as a response of something. But what we are seeing post-election, that's where that conversation comes in. Because we notice that they have become so powerful, now we are using uncontrollable. Now every day there's something that we have to, literally have to wait until 8 p.m. where we have the national television channel, with the news saying that news that is circulating on social media is fake information. So I think up until the election, there was just sort of like reactions to what the state was doing to make them understand that they didn't believe that. But post-election, now I think the mimification has now entered a space where it's navigating disinformation, misinformation, and I guess it's just a way that young people has found to challenge the status quo. So now we have to deal with it.
Tendo, any examples of disinformation that you've seen circulating?
Yeah, I would like, so the state actors question as well, right? I think, yeah, I think this is where I think George and I kind of have similar things in the sense that I probably tap into some of the accounts that he has looked into, which is, it's not state actors, but more like state aligned actors, in the sense that these general citizens pushing a certain message that is aligned / sponsored by the state. But George might be better positioned to answer that and what that means in this specific context. But that was my case. It wasn't state actors, as in it wasn't like a minister saying the genocide didn't happen. It was a normal citizen that is more aligned with the state.
George?
Thanks. I guess on that, so yeah, like Rutendo says, what I was looking at was there were, at the top you had state actors, and then they were, in a sense, they were farming out these non-state actors and, you know, ordinary citizens. Some of them are actually working in South Africa or in the UK here. One of them, as I was tracking, used to be a former employee of the MOD, like he used to be a former British soldier. And so these are very kind of strange, you know, combination of people, like these kind of strange bedfellows of people who are doing part of this work. But in the book, if you look, so there's the chapter on Ethiopia that actually looks at different citizens who are participating in pushing disinformation. So people are using selfies, and these are people who support different sides of the war in Ethiopia who are using selfies. So that's one chapter in the book that really focuses in on citizens. And the other chapter that focuses on non-state actors is the one on gender disinformation, that looks at the ways that women political candidates are being attacked in very gendered ways, and this kind of reassertion of patriarchal power. And that is sometimes being done by, you know, other male candidates, but also by ordinary citizens, and a kind of reassertion of patriarchy and these kind of attacks that come from these actors, these very misogynistic actors. So there is a sense, at least in the book, there is a flavor of those non-state actors who are also participating in these kind of activities.
Yeah, just to pick up on Kevin's question. So there are examples in the book of disinformation that is from non-state actors. But it's the power analysis that really shows that it's when the state mobilizes its institutional resources that it's able to mount organized, coordinated, multi-actor campaigns that have far more influence than me telling a lie online when nobody's following me and I don't really have any reach. So George's chapter does a really good job of breaking down the subcomponents of that machine and showing how the different actors have different roles, and how they add up to more than the sum of their parts. But there are definitely examples of non-state actors using disinformation, and where that is powerful is where they're organized. So someone was talking earlier about the political economy of disinformation. So where, and it's usually organized right-wing networks that have YouTube channels that are able to monetize and draw in cash, that they're able to have disproportionate influence. So again, if you or I say something on YouTube, no one's really listening. But if it's part of a coordinated network where they're using the same language, it can be far more influential. Okay, Becky has had to leave us. She has family responsibilities, but we still have another 10 or 15 minutes if there are other questions from the floor. Yes, sorry, the questions online, maybe I can come to Rutendo and Edmilson, you can see the questions behind, but they pick up on two things. One is, how does the digital divide play out in these power relationships and disinformation? And the second question is, with most elections being in the rural area, which have limited access to these services, how does that affect the impact of disinformation?
What's the question again? Oh, okay. Okay,
So in a lot of the countries
okay.
there might only be 17 or 20% of the population that are online. So why is it a big deal if disinformation is happening?
Right. I think this is actually quite interesting. Like I said, the elections that happened in 2022 saw the country witness the most disputed elections, especially in the urban area. But funny enough, when you look at the results from majority of the rural areas where the ruling party won, and which managed to make sure that the current government continues to be in power, I think access to connectivity still continues to be a huge challenge over there. So I think it's very hard for us to sort of, look at the channels of disinformation that are being used in urban context and compare them with the rural ones, because I think the case of Angola is like a combination of both. And that's why I said in Angola, the information starts from the national television channels, which is perhaps the space where the power has control. And then it moves into the social media, and then it comes back into the national television channel as a debate to make sure that people really have to understand that this is an information. So I think the case of Angola is sort of alludes to how in the rural areas, these can perhaps become for the ruling party a challenge if it reaches there, because the results from the urban areas showcase that the disinformation strategies are not working. So it's very hard for us to tell, because majority of the areas where we saw the ruling party winning, the access to connectivity is non-existent pretty much, and there isn't really much data for us to be able to really see how those channels are making an impact in those areas.
Thank you, Edmund. And George, do you want to come in on this question? Why do we care about Twitter if such few have access?
I guess there are two ways of answering that. And because I was studying a government that is investing energy into it, so we care about it because the government cares enough about it to invest energy into it. And we're trying to understand, so what is the government trying to do? The trouble, of course, with disinformation is that you can never actually track how much impact it has. You know that people are disseminating this kind of disinformation, and to then say, because of this message, this number of people voted in this way, it's hard. Many disinformation studies haven't been able to do that. But we care about it because governments clearly care about it, and they're investing energy to do it. But the second point is to say that the digital is part of a wider information ecosystem. So the kinds of messages that are being pushed, and this is to also go into what Edmilson has said. So the kinds of information I saw on Twitter, so Twitter is almost like an elite space of conversation between the kinds of people who can afford to do it and who have the wherewithal to be on. But those messages are being echoed on state-controlled radio and state-controlled TV. So there's a kind of similar messaging that's happening there. So, and some of the screenshots that are of tweets that are being pushed out on Twitter are then finding their way onto WhatsApp. So this larger information ecosystem makes it such that even though there's a wider digital divide, information is filtering into different kinds of media, and because of that, it's almost as if like Rutendo was saying earlier, that divide between the digital and the non-digital world is becoming very, very gray, as she put it earlier. So now the way that I approach it is to be to at least see these kind of worlds as being somewhat connected, and the boundaries as being very porous. So those are the kind of ways I think about that question.
Thank you, George. Rutendo.
I just want to add a third thing to the structure that George provided, which based on the first factor, which is the government cares about it. And why the government cares about it is because in social media doesn't exist only in advice. So Zimbabwean users of Twitter don't only talk to Zimbabweans about Zimbabwean issues. The government is not on Twitter just to talk to us Zimbabweans as well. They're there for policy to create a certain image as well. So part of the reason why this is important is because this is part of this sort of seeps into other geopolitical conversations, whether be it regional or things of that nature, of that sort. It is part of a geopolitical diplomacy, so to speak, as well. And I think that's why it is also important to consider, including the fact that it doesn't just stay on Twitter, even though, you know, the digital divide might make fewer people access Twitter, more people access WhatsApp, and those things seep over there as well. So putting those two factors together, it then shows why it is even more important to understand that space, because it is not in its own vacuum. It is a part of a much larger ecosystem, but beyond that, part of a much larger regional and global ecosystem of communication and conversation as well.
And exactly that plays out in the Mozambique chapter, where interestingly, the Portuguese conversation happens on Facebook, and there's this tiny conversation in English on Twitter, which is directed at diplomats, and the international audience is not for internal consumption. I'll come to your question.
Hi, my name is Niranjan. I'm a researcher at the Power and Popular Politics Cluster. I had two questions, and I'm sorry if it's not going to be said in a very clear manner. So one of them has to do with the relationship between disinformation and general trust in electoral systems. Is there any clarity? I mean, I know George said that it's really hard to kind of, you know, connect disinformation with certain changes, but I was wondering if there's any clarity or any sense of how disinformation relates to voter turnout and just general trust in electoral systems. And secondly, I was curious about how effective you know, fact checkers are in actually convincing people about something being disinformation, because my understanding is that recent studies have found that people still believe what they politically kind of believe in anyway. So I just want to get a sense of the effectiveness of fact checkers and their role in fighting disinformation.
And just to be clear, the first question was the relationship between disinformation and electoral systems.
Yeah,
ecosystems.
trust in electoral systems and voter turnout.
Okay. George, just for a change, can we come to you first?
Thanks, Tony. So in Zimbabwe, there haven't been studies on those two particular variables and trying to track them and how one influences the other. But what we know in Zimbabwe is that generally there's a lot of voter apathy, especially with the young people. And there's a kind of disengagement with the political process. And that's partly because I think people are getting a sense that politics doesn't really change anything. And you know, maybe politicians are out to fill their own pockets and not really look to sort of promoting the interests of the majority. So you're getting a situation where in general there's political apathy, especially amongst the youth, and you can see this in terms of youth voter registration, and people are trying rather to vote with their feet and try and find jobs out of the country. But the other thing that I think which you can see with disinformation and politics is that there's this informational paralysis, and I think this is a deliberate aim whereby they're trying to just confuse people so that you don't know what is actually true and what isn't. Is it really true that people are stealing gold in Zimbabwe, or are they not? What is really true? And that kind of informational paralysis, it affects the ability to build coalitions and networks of solidarity to actually campaign against certain things that are supposedly happening, or certain malfeasance within the government. So that kind of informational paralysis is something that I found, especially when I was looking at least the research I was doing. And then fact checkers are. So again, there hasn't been research in particular on Zimbabwe, but I agree with you. The research that I've found is that it's not really, the way disinformation hacks our brain is not really about a logical, is this true or not? It actually touches on things that are emotionally resonant to people. And because of that, because of the way it hacks our brain and our emotions, that's why this information becomes very kind of powerful and resonant in people's minds and shapes behavior. So just a fact checker, it's not really an effective way of helping to defang disinformation.
Nelson? I know in your chapter you talk about that kind of youth disengagement or claim disengagement, but your argument is slightly different.
Exactly. That's what I was just listening to George. I think in the Angolan case, it's actually the opposite. instead of being political apathy, what we see is actually political excitement. And I think it's sort of like when the disinformation is sort of like challenging people's capacity to think, they want to react in a way that shows case that they actually are aware of what you're trying to do. I think the Angolan case is perhaps one that shows case how all these episodes that were being created by the system were sort of, pushing people towards, waiting, exciting for the elections, because they understood that that would be the moment there that would be able to really express themselves and make people understand that they're actually aware of what has been happening. And I think they did, because of it. Like I said, the results in the capital city showed that. And there was a whole celebration on it. So I think, like I said, young people in Angola, they're not whining on politics. They're actually expressing themselves through new channels of political participation via digital spaces and memes.
Not on the electoral situation, of course, because that's not the work that I do have done. But just on the fact checkers one, I did speak to two, and I think I just want to sort of add a bit of grayness and maybe muddy the conversation a bit, unfortunately, which is so I guess it depends, the effectiveness depends on what disinformation they're countering, right? Because I think that that's the other thing about disinformation, is like different types of disinformation. And at least in my chapter, the two people that sort of act as the fact checkers, one is a documentary filmmaker and journalist, and then the other one is a human rights activist. And they speak of how, it's easy when they can easily fact check things about when did this happen, how did this happen. They can bring that in, and they actually see that the disinformation actors actually go silent. However, it's certain things, such as one of the biggest issues is how many people were either died or disappeared or harmed by this. So there's a report that was written by the Catholic Church that estimates 20,000 disappeared, killed, maimed, etc., just generally affected. That estimate comes from, a whole other research thing. Now, fact checkers obviously try to explain that this comes from a specific estimate and all of that, but the disinformation around that just doesn't go silent, and so it's very ineffective. So in cases like that, where it's already gray and is based on like that sort of emotion, fact checking is not necessarily they're just useful. And so I think it depends on what type of disinformation that fact checking is addressing as well, just to sort of muddy that for a bit.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question from the back and maybe one from the chat.
Thank you, Tony. I'm Jo Carpenter from the IDS Monitoring, Evaluation and Learning team. My question follows on a little bit from yours, Niranjan, and it's more about the legitimacy of fact checkers. I've worked on evaluations of fact-checking organizations in Eastern Europe, and they're quite often aligned with one side or the other. So I wanted to ask, if this is all about trying to support open national debate, do you think that sometimes the term disinformation might be unhelpful? Because if you're calling something disinformation, then that spawns services or actors who want to verify information, but they're coming from a particular point of view. So I guess my question is, who gets to verify and why? And is that also part of the architecture of disinformation itself? So does the word disinformation sort of get co-opted and brought into this in itself? So I think it'd be really useful and helpful for me to hear your reflections on how you support open, representative dialogue rather than people calling each other liars online, I guess. That's my question. I don't know if it's a helpful one.
Who would like to tackle that question? I'm happy to talk to it, but George?
I guess maybe the place to start maybe on when we're using the term disinformation, we're using it in a very specific way, and we're contrasting it from misinformation and from malinformation, and so we're trying to use it in a very, and not as a slur that is being sort of, you know, bandied about in online conversation. So we're trying to maybe define it in a very specific way as intentional lies that are meant to achieve a particular goal, particularly often political goal or a power-related goal, and so that's how we're trying to define it in that very clear way. In terms of when I look at who gets to verify and why they refer, the kinds of cases I've seen are people who are journalists and sometimes civil society organizations who are doing that kind of work. And in those cases, it's not necessarily that they have a dog in the fight in that way. Often, quite often, it's the state that is passing out information that is dubious, or maybe opposition parties. But I haven't quite seen that case where these organizations get drawn into the whole mess in that way. So I'd be interested to hear more about the cases maybe in Eastern Europe where this happens. But those are my thoughts on that subject.
Yeah, I guess it's undeniably the case that some of the fact-checking organizations out there are there to create disinformation. If you had the US Secret Service's budget of £100 billion a year, you're probably going to set up some fact-checking organizations or fund ones that are already inclined to proffer your point of view. There's no getting away from that, but I think the way I would operate is, as a researcher, is to triangulate. I would use sources that I believe are trustworthy, and so the fact checking that I give credence is from the United Nations, from Amnesty International, from organizations that I judge to have a track record of acting as honest brokers. And I think that's the way I would go. How has it played out for you? Are there fact-checking organizations in Angola and Zimbabwe?
When it comes to the Angolan case and specific election, I think the episodes that I share in the book, they don't really relate to it in a perspective or fact checkers. For us, let's say if the ruling party creates a disinformation specific for somebody, as if you as a position leader, you didn't go to that university, the fact checker would have to be that leader. So what we saw most of the cases is when disinformation happens, we always saw sort of like a reaction from the person that is involved to make sure that he communicates that that's a lie, whether it's him showing on social media his certificate from that university, I actually studied there, whether it's him showing cases that he have, given up his citizenship, his Portuguese citizenship, so he's actually allowed to run for presidency. So when it comes to the Angolan case, what we saw most of the times is people would rely on the person involved in this information to then understand that, no, this is a lie because the facts is here. So we didn't really have cases where we'd have to go to the extent of actually going there and say, okay, that's actually factual. This is why this is a disinformation. So it was very, like I said, like it's more like a political game rather than disinformation that will force people to then have to go and research, okay, this is facts, this is not facts. So yeah.
Yeah, I think in my case it's pretty much just like George said. I mean, it's just the same context, which is fact checkers are usually journalists or civil society organizations, and it's more in response to already, like, disinformation that's already out there. So it's not necessarily I think the two big ones would be Site, which and Newswire are really pretty big, I would say fact checkers. They don't only do fact checking, but they're trained journalists that are really good at that. And I think it's more like a response, reactive response, as opposed to then something that can be easily co-opted for disinformation specifically, like George said, understanding disinformation to be different from mis and malinformation.
Okay, so the last question is a kind of a future-looking question. In the chat, somebody called anonymous attendee, could be a bot, could have been AI generated question, I don't know, but says, how do we think AI may affect democracy in the future? And what suggestions are there for countries looking to defend themselves? So I think we can imagine that as a wider question about what next in this space. The danger of writing a book like this is that it takes 2 years to publish, and by the time it's been published, maybe the technology has moved on and you're out of date. In the first chapter on gender disinformation, it does already start to talk about deep fakes and shallow fakes, and that's certainly on the horizon. Where do you see the future of disinformation, and how do we protect ourselves? Ed Milson?
Well, I think for the Angolan case, like I said, this is very premature. And I think the fact that we have perhaps got enough data to say that this is a space that is here to stay and that is here to influence politics, I really do see sort of like a more, I guess, a more e-governance taking place in the context of countries like Angola, where we still, doing things in a very traditional way, but as we can see that there's no way for us to avoid these, new realities. I really do believe that this will become our day-to-day practices. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the next elections, we'll be definitely talking about AI and how that has influenced the election of 2027. So I really do see these as continue to develop and people continue to embrace it rather than people trying to close these spaces, because we're talking about countries that have very centralized, that are, the offline space for participation is very limited. And I think the fact that these online spaces are working in favor of citizens that are perhaps accounting for the majority, I think we'll definitely see more people engaging within those spaces, and perhaps the governments embracing it, because I think they can now see that they cannot stop it or they cannot close it, even if they continue to, invest into infrastructures that would stop these spaces. So this is what I foresee in the case of the Angolan case.
Agenda?
I don't know if I can say that what I can foresee in Zimbabwe specifically, apart from it being a context where it's kind of difficult to make any predictions, at least for me. But I think just generally, I want to try and balance the sort of techno-optimism and techno-pessimism and fear of AI, as well as like the reality. I think sometimes we tend to think that it's moving fast and bigger and better than it actually is. So I think it's not an answer, but it's just, I think, to kind of encourage that the conversations consider that it's probably not always as good, scary, or big as we think it is. However, that being said, I do see some sort of concerns / gaps / opportunities and potential spaces. I think one of the things is, with the affordances that social media specifically provides for multimedia information, obviously it goes without saying that we can see better tempered with images, better tempered with multimedia. That could become difficult for the ordinary person to try to decipher whether or not, it is AI generated or whether or not it is actually true or happened. And so that might make disinformation a little bit look a bit more realistic. And then I think the other thing is also just the misuse, intentional or unintentional misuse of certain AI tools. So I think just a quick example is the way that we see the conversations around GPT as an LLM, and people not understanding the difference between an LLM and a search engine. Whether or not something can be used to fact check versus whether or not something is simply used to generate something / predict the next word within a sentence or within a group of text. I think that might be another thing that might definitely affect that. Don't have much else to say really, but yeah.
Thank you, Rutenda. And George, you have the last word.
I guess the key thing for me, what I'd preface my comments is saying is that there are a number of factors that are shaping democracy in African countries, and it's not just technology. There are a number of questions around institutions, around histories of, political, relationships. So things like the problems of presidential systems that are more powerful than the parliament and the judiciary. And so there are a number of problems that relate to institutions. So AI will be coming within this rather more complicated political milieu, and in many senses it could make things worse by empowering states more. We have an example, for example, in Zimbabwe, where there are these cameras that are supposed to do a lot of facial recognition. There's a deal that has been made. So you have an already authoritarian state that is beginning to use these cameras that can enable it to implement more and more tighter security. So you have those kind of situations where if you add AI into an already authoritarian situation, the outcome is unlikely to be very positive. So it's not going to have a very emancipatory effect. So this is the kind of concern I would have in a context where you have a number of authoritarian governments that are more interested in aggrandizing their power. And then the question is, can citizens make use of AI in more emancipatory ways? The challenge on that side is that a number of countries, citizens have not actually had access to this. The last time I was in Zimbabwe, ChatGPT was not allowed. There were local models that people were trying to fine tune and create, but people didn't have. ChatGPT was actually banned in Zimbabwe at that point. So because of that, I don't quite see citizens being able to make use of AI for emancipatory, purposes quite yet. And I think the governments have stolen the march at this particular point. When it was the era of social media, citizens and civil society were far ahead, at least in Zimbabwe, and the government was caught flat-footed. But with AI, my sense is that the government is running ahead of citizens and civil society.
Thank you, George. And thank you to panelists. For those of you in the room, there are copies of the physical book at the back of the room. And for those of you online, it's free to download and open access. I'd like to thank my colleagues from IDS for organizing this event and the technology. Thank our distinguished guests from the Embassy of Angola, and to thank all of you in the room and online for being here. And please thank our three panelists.